Winter, 1885. Out on the vast plains of the American West, the world wasn't just cold, it was indifferent. The kind of silence that wraps around you and doesn't let go. The kind of wind that doesn't just chill your skin but scrapes at your soul. And in the middle of all that emptiness stood a man, Thomas Benton. He was 28, but life had carved deeper years into his face than any calendar ever could. The wind, the sun, the weight of loss, it had all left their marks. Lines etched around his eyes, a kind of permanent squint, like someone who no longer trusts the horizon. They said he was handsome in town back before he disappeared, but not the kind of handsome that makes people smile. More like the sharp edges of a mountain, beautiful from a distance, but impossible to touch. Thomas lived alone in a cabin, if you could even call it that. Just four walls on a ridge, huddled against the wind like it didn't want to be there either. That cabin wasn't a home. It was defiance, a stubborn, "I'm still here," carved out of dust and pain. Just 2 years earlier, his life had looked different. He had a wife. They were expecting a child. And then the fever came. In 1 week, both were gone. The town, with its pitying eyes and 2 quiet voices, became unbearable. No one ever tells you how loud silence can be when it's filled with what you've lost. So Thomas left, sold everything, took what little he had left and claimed a piece of land far from anyone or anything, out where no one would look at him like a broken man. But the prairie doesn't care if you're grieving, it doesn't offer comfort, it doesn't listen, it just is. And if you want to stay, you work. So Thomas worked. Wake before dawn, mend fences, haul water, feed the cattle that barely held on through snow and wolves, eat alone, sleep alone, wake again. Repeat. It wasn't a life. It was survival, a routine with no destination. Days melted into each other like snow against skin, brief, cold, forgettable. The only sounds were the wind, the creak of wood, and the occasional rifle shot when a coyote got too close. His hands were scarred, rough. His voice, when he did speak, was more gravel than sound, even when he talked to himself, which was rare. Inside, the cabin was stripped bare, a single cot, a small table, a stove, a shelf with tins of beans and flour. No keepsakes, no softness, except for one thing, a small silver locket, tarnished, hidden beneath his shirt, the only remnant of what once was. Thomas wasn't living. He was enduring, holding on like a root in dry soil. Grief had built walls around him, thick ones, not to keep people out, but to keep the pain in, to stop it from leaking into the small spaces he'd carved out to survive. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a ghost, haunting the life he might have had. And maybe you've known someone like that. Maybe you've been someone like that, carrying grief like a stone in your gut, too heavy to move, too real to ignore. People think time heals everything, but they don't tell you what it leaves behind. Some wounds close, some just scab over and throb every time it rains. But the thing about life, even when you try to shut it out, is that it finds a way in. A crack in the wall, a loose floorboard, a moment you didn't expect. And sometimes it comes not with warmth, but with something colder, stranger, more human. That moment was coming for Thomas Benton. He didn't know it yet. Out on the far side of his land, where the canyon drops low and the sky opens wide, life was waiting, tied to a tree, broken but breathing. A woman who would force him to choose between the safety of silence and the danger of care. But for now, he didn't know her name. He didn't know she was even out there. He just knew the wind was rising, the sky turning gray. Another long night was on its way, and he would face it the same way he faced every other, alone. Because when you've lost everything, sometimes you believe that's all you deserve. And yet, even the harshest land, even the loneliest man can still feel the faintest stir of something different. A shift, a presence, a pull. Something was coming, something that would break the silence, crack the walls, and maybe, just maybe, remind Thomas what it means to live again. It was late afternoon when Thomas Benton first saw the calf. He'd been tracking it for over an hour, its tiny hoofprints barely visible along the edge of his claim, where the land sloped into a canyon thick with juniper and scrub oak. The sky hung low and heavy, bruised with the promise of rain. A cold wind had started to pick up, curling around the trees, whispering warnings. That's when he saw her. At first he thought it was just a shadow, some illusion cast by wind and branches. But then his eyes adjusted. No illusion. A woman. Tied to one of the old oaks, her arms stretched cruelly above her head, ankles bound at the trunk. He froze. His heart slammed once, hard. This land was lonely, desolate. Who could have done this? As he approached, slow and cautious, rifle loose in his hands, he scanned the brush. Nothing, just the rising wind and the low rattle of dry leaves. Her hair, dark and wild, whipped around her face. She looked barely conscious, her head bowed. But then, as he got closer, she lifted it. And he stopped cold. She wasn't just injured, she was breathtaking. Not in the fragile, pretty kind of way, but in that raw, elemental sense, like a cliff edge or a storm at sea. Fierce and vulnerable all at once. Her skin was dusted with dirt, a cut above her brow streaked with dried blood. But her eyes, those dark, wide eyes, were defiant, alive. Above her head, nailed into the bark, was a rough piece of wood. The words had been burned into it. Only the pure deserve to live. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. The weight of those words settled in his stomach like ice. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a message, a warning. He lowered his rifle. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't used it much lately. She flinched, her body tensing, eyes darting at him. He raised a hand, slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond. Her mouth was dry, cracked, but she was listening, watching, still fierce under the fear. He stepped closer and drew his knife, keeping his movements careful, deliberate. "I'm going to cut you loose." No answer, but she didn't pull away when he reached for the ropes. They were thick, dug into her wrists, stained with old blood. Whoever tied them had meant for her to stay. Thomas saw how small her wrists were, how cruelly tight the bindings had been. When the last rope gave way, her arms dropped. She crumpled forward, gasping, collapsing to her knees. He knelt beside her, leaving space. "You all right?" A stupid question. Of course she wasn't. She nodded anyway, barely. She didn't speak much, but something shifted in her posture. Not trust, not yet, but maybe something close to hope. A flicker. She tried to stand, wincing as she tested her legs. He steadied her with a glance, not a hand. "My cabin's not far. You need water, food, shelter." She hesitated. Looked at him, really looked at him. Not just a white man in the wilderness, but this man, scarred, silent, grief on two legs. He saw it in her eyes, the question, "Can I trust you?" Behind her, the hateful sign creaked in the wind. That question became a decision. She nodded, and just like that,
Everything Thomas thought he knew about his life shifted. As they walked, he kept his distance but glanced back often. She limped, favoring one leg, her breath shallow, but she never asked to stop, never once looked back. The wind clawed at them both. The prairie, indifferent as always, watched their slow retreat. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the sign. Only the pure deserved to live. He'd heard whispers in town, ugly talk about savages, about purging the land. But this was worse. This was fanatical, cruel, organized. And it had a face now. Her. Back at the cabin, he opened the door and stepped aside. She hesitated just a second, then walked inside. The space felt suddenly different. Not warmer, just not empty. He lit the stove, offered her water. Her hands trembled, but she drank slowly. Then she whispered, "Aihi, Navajo, thank you." He blinked, surprised to hear anything at all. "You're welcome." It was the first human conversation he'd had in months. She didn't speak much after that. But she watched everything, the cabin, the way I moved, the fire, the rifle, like someone trained to see danger in small things. Thomas understood that instinct. It had kept him alive too. When he offered her the cot for the night, she didn't respond right away, just studied him. What did he expect? What did he want? "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "You're safe here." She nodded, a tiny motion, then sat, still tense, still braced for something that might never come. He laid his bedroll by the door, rifle close, not to protect himself from her, but for her. That night the wind howled against the cabin walls. He lay awake, listening to her breath on the cot. Slow, uneven. But she was breathing. She was alive. And so was something in him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story. But he knew this. Leaving her there tied to that tree, that would have been the true death of him. He'd built a prison out here, thinking it would protect him from pain. But maybe, just maybe, that same pain was now leading him back to life.
The rope snapped with the final crack. Thomas Benton had done plenty of hard things in his life, burying a wife, burying a future, surviving winters no man should have. But this felt different. Not harder exactly, just more human. As the last knot fell away and the woman collapsed to her knees, he knew nothing would be the same after this. She didn't speak, just knelt there in the dirt, clutching her wrists, the raw skin bright red against the bark. Her dark hair fell like a curtain over her face, but he could feel her watching him from behind it. Watching, measuring, wondering if he was just the next danger in a long line of cruel men. He knelt down beside her, careful not to reach out. "You all right?" he asked quietly, even though he knew the answer. Of course she wasn't. She was tied to a tree with a message of hate nailed over her head in the middle of nowhere, and no one coming to help. But still, she nodded. Just once. Maybe out of instinct, maybe out of will. He helped her to her feet, his hands hovering more than touching. She swayed, weak and unsteady. Her body said, "Run," but her legs said, "Not yet." He took a breath and said, "My cabin's not far. You need water, food, somewhere warm." There was a moment right then that hung in the cold air. A moment where she could have turned away, limped back into the wild and taken her chances. But instead she looked up. Her eyes, dark and bottomless, locked onto his. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was survival. A wordless calculation. Is this man a threat? Or a chance? She nodded again, and they started walking. Back at the cabin, the sky had already begun to bruise into evening. Thomas opened the door and stepped aside.
She paused on the threshold, peering inside. The place was spare, cold, but it was shelter, and right now that was everything. He lit the fire first. Flames licked at the logs as he poured water into a tin cup from the bucket by the stove. She stood just inside, still near the door, still ready to bolt if something changed. He offered her the cup. Her hands trembled as she took it. Cracked, dirty fingers wrapped around the metal, but she drank. Slowly, deliberately, like someone remembering what it meant to trust water again. Then softly, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, she said, "He." Thomas blinked. "You're welcome," he replied, surprised. It was Navajo for thank you. He hadn't expected her to speak English, or anything, really. He just assumed she was too far gone for words. But somehow, even this tiny exchange, water passed from one hand to another, cracked open something between them. He moved around the cabin, gathering supplies. Heated some beans in a pot, sliced dried jerky onto a plate. Nothing fancy, nothing soft, but warm, nourishing. He motioned her to sit at the table. She didn't move at first, but after a moment she eased herself into the single chair. Her eyes never left the food, or him. They ate in silence, him on the floor, her at the table. Just a few feet apart, but it felt like miles. She still hadn't told him her name, and he didn't ask. Not yet. When the meal was done, he cleared the plate and poured her more water. She drank again, more confidently this time. He noticed the way her eyes moved, sharp, thoughtful, never still. She wasn't just surviving, she was watching, learning. "You can take the cot tonight," he said quietly, gesturing to the narrow bed against the wall. "I'll take the floor." She glanced from him to the bed and back again. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Another calculation, another unspoken question. What does he want in return? Thomas shook his head, almost like he could hear her thoughts. "I won't harm you. You're safe here." For a long second, she didn't respond. But then, finally, she nodded. Just slightly, and walked over to the cot. She didn't undress, didn't even remove her shoes, just sat down stiffly, curling in on herself like someone who had learned not to relax ever. Thomas rolled out his blanket by the door, rifle within reach, not because he didn't trust her, but because something darker might still be out there, the kind of people who would tie someone to a tree for being born the wrong color or asking the wrong question. He knew the scent of jammin' child too well. The fire dimmed, the cabin sank into silence. Outside the wind moaned like it was mourning something. Thomas stared into the shadows until they blurred. He listened to her breathing, shallow, uneven, then slower, softer. Sleep. And in that tiny cabin where grief had lived alone for 2 long years, there was now something else. Not quite peace, not yet, but presence. He didn't know what would come next, didn't even know her name, but he had brought her here, and she had stayed. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.
At first, the silence between them was cautious, fragile, like the space between 2 wild animals, unsure whether to run or stay. But in time, it became something else entirely, a kind of unspoken truce, a rhythm. And then, without them meaning to, it became comfort. Thomas Benton had lived alone for 2 years, not just physically alone, but in the way a soul can retreat so deep inside itself that even a mirror forgets your face. His life was built around distance, between him and town, between him and memory, between him and feeling anything that might crack the shell he'd carefully put in place after burying his wife and unborn child. But now, there was someone else in his cabin, a woman who said little, asked for nothing, and yet changed everything by simply being there. Her name was still unknown to him.
She hadn't offered it, and he hadn't asked. It felt like naming her would be forcing something, and there was a kind of quiet respect in leaving that space untouched. Some truths didn't have to come quickly. Some truths arrive the way dawn does, soft, gradual, inevitable. She helped, without being asked, folded her blanket each morning, tidied the small space around her. She swept the dirt floor, rearranged the shelves, repaired a loose hinge on the door without a word. Thomas noticed, of course. He noticed everything, because in silence, attention becomes sharp, and in her presence, the world he dulled now came back into focus. She observed him too, the way he moved, the way he paused before touching the stove, or how his hands lingered over the locket he kept tucked beneath his shirt. She didn't ask about it, but she knew it meant something. You can tell a lot about a person, not by what they show you, but by what they protect. They didn't speak, but they were learning each other's language anyway. One morning, Thomas was splitting firewood outside, the rhythm of the axe grounding him in the present. He looked up and saw her watching from the window. Not intruding, not judging, just there. Her gaze wasn't curious, it was understanding. She saw in him what others had chosen not to see, a man who wasn't broken, just unfinished. That night, he finally spoke. "I had a wife," he said, staring into the fire. "We were expecting, but the fever came, took them both." He didn't look at her. He wasn't telling the story for a reaction. He was just setting something down that had been too heavy for too long. She died on a Wednesday. Baby didn't make it through the night. After that, I couldn't breathe in that town anymore. There was a long pause. The fire cracked, a log settling deeper into the flame. I came out here to forget. Thought if I got far enough away, I wouldn't feel it anymore. Still no words from her. But he didn't need any. Her silence didn't feel empty. It felt like listening. Then, softly, she spoke. "I was cast out," she said. Her voice was steady, low. "From my village." Thomas turned to her, surprised. "They said I was poisoned. Too many questions, too many ideas. I wanted to learn, to speak my thoughts. That was dangerous." She folded her hands tightly in her lap. "They said I wasn't pure anymore, that I had been infected by white ways. They feared what I might teach the younger ones." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. That phrase, "not pure," echoed the words carved in the wood above her head when he found her. Only the pure deserved to live. He realized then that their pain wasn't the same, but it rhymed. She had been driven out by fear and tradition. He had been buried by loss and silence. Both had been marked by others, then left to figure out what came next. "They threw stones," she added after a moment. "Shouted names. Said I was cursed." "That's not curse. That's courage." She looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, something passed between them that wasn't just sympathy. It was recognition. Two people who had been pushed beyond the borders of what others called belonging, and somehow in this cabin, they'd both stepped back into the circle, just by being seen. Over the following days, they spoke more. A word here, a sentence there. Thomas taught her English words: fire, water, sky. She repeated them, careful and precise. In return, she taught him bits of her own language: Navajo, Nutsa, wind, tow, water, tse, rock. Words that felt like the land itself. They cooked together in silence, passed tools wordlessly, shared space with a kind of mutual grace. He noticed how she always organized things when he was outside, made the place feel less temporary, less like a shelter, and more like a home. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she stepped outside and sat on the cabin's front steps while he worked. "You work hard," he shrugged. "Land doesn't give anything for free." She nodded, then added quietly, "But you don't ask for much either." He paused, axe midair, struck by the truth in that simple statement. It wasn't just that he had lost people, it was that he had stopped asking anything of the world afterward. No comfort, no joy, no companionship. Just silence and routine. But now, here she was. And for the first time, he realized the silence he had built wasn't protection. It was exile. And she, this woman once left to die, had crossed that invisible line without forcing her way in. Maybe that's how healing begins. Not with fanfare or big declarations, but with presence. With being willing to sit beside someone in their quiet, until that quiet begins to shift. She didn't need saving. He didn't need fixing. But somehow, together, they were learning to live again. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. And sometimes, that's more than enough.
Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself with a smile. Sometimes it sneaks in slowly, like light through a cracked shutter. Quiet, uninvited, but necessary. That's how it began between Thomas and Nahili. In a cabin meant for solitude, they began to build something else. Not a home, not yet, but a shared space, carved out of caution, softened by routine, and slowly, carefully, lit by trust. They didn't start with confessions, they started with simple words. Thomas would point to the stove, fire. She would repeat, then point to her chest, Navajo. He'd smile, nod, then point to the sky, cloud. She, Yas. Each word they traded felt like a brick taken down from the wall between them. Not demolished, not rushed, just disassembled, one gesture at a time. He learned that she liked her coffee black, that she folded her blanket with perfect corners, that she always listened with her whole body, like she was trained to catch the weight of things left unsaid. She learned that he mumbled when he was working, that he never sat with his back to the window, that some days he got quieter, not out of anger, but out of remembering. They didn't talk about feelings, not directly, but feelings still lived there, in the way she placed the tin cup a little closer to him in the morning, or how he kept the fire stoked long after she'd gone to bed. It was one of those late evenings with the wind resting outside and the fire cracking softly that she said it. "Loss leaves a hole," Nahili murmured, her voice gentle but certain. "It does not ever truly fill, but life can grow around it." Thomas looked up from where he was rolling tobacco, fingers paused mid-motion. That sentence hit harder than any sermon he'd ever sat through. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even meant to comfort, but it was true. He'd spent so long staring into that hole of grief, of guilt, of loneliness, that he hadn't noticed anything trying to grow around it. Her words didn't fix anything. They didn't erase his pain. They made room for it. And in that room, something else could breathe. So he told her about the first time he held his wife's hand, how she used to braid her hair before bed and hum songs he never knew the names of. He told her how helpless he'd felt when the fever came, how quickly joy had turned into burial. He hadn't said any of it out loud since the day they died, but saying it to Nahili didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like planting a flower at the edge of it. She listened without interruption, without pity, just presence.
Then she told him more of her own story, about her mother's laughter, about a younger sister who used to dance when no one was looking, about the day she stood up at the village gathering and asked why certain rules applied only to women, and how the silence that followed felt colder than any winter storm. "I wasn't angry," she said. "I was just curious." Thomas chuckled softly. "That's always the dangerous kind of woman, isn't it? The ones who ask, why?" Nahili didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. He realized something in that moment. She hadn't just been cast out. She'd been erased, silenced, told she was too much for a world that had grown too small. And yet, she had survived, not just physically, but spiritually. She still carried fire, and not the kind that destroys, the kind that warms a room on the coldest night. Over the days that followed, they kept teaching each other, more than just words. She showed him how to track subtle shifts in the wind, how to find signs of game by the tilt of grass or the marks in snow. He showed her how to fix a rifle stock, how to trap a rabbit without leaving signs behind. But it wasn't the survival skills that mattered most. It was the way they looked at each other now, not as strangers, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals, as people who had both been broken and didn't need fixing, just witnessing. The silence between them was still there, but now it held something sacred. Shared breath, shared pain, shared peace. He would lie awake some nights, not haunted, but wondering how had someone the world tried to erase become the one who reminded him how to live. And maybe that's the point. Maybe healing doesn't come from being saved. Maybe it comes from being seen. Not for what you lost, but for what you still carry. Nahili never called him a hero. He never asked her to explain what had happened under that tree. But in quiet moments, when her eyes met his across the flickering fire, he knew whatever they were building, it was real. And it started with a word, a pause. A space between two people willing to stay when the world told them to run. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't need a grand gesture. Sometimes it just needs two people, grieving, surviving, who decide, quietly, to stay.
Storms out on the prairie don't just come. They arrive like judgment, sudden, loud, unforgiving. That night, as snow rolled in like a curtain of white fury and the wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, something darker came with it. Not the cold, not the isolation, but men, 5 of them, riders cloaked in frost and hate, their outlines barely visible through the blizzard. Thomas had felt it before he saw them, a shift in the wind that didn't feel like weather, a silence outside that wasn't natural. He peeked through the frosted window and saw the shadows moving in slow formation. They had come for her. Nahili was by the stove when he turned around, his face pale but steady. She didn't have to ask. She already knew. "They're here," he said. And in her eyes, those deep, dark desert night eyes, was a flicker of something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not yet. Something older, like she'd expected this. Because when the world marks you as impure, it never just lets you walk away. Outside, the wind roared. Stones began slamming against the side of the cabin. Not the storm, them. Voices rose next, muffled shouts twisted by the snow, demands, slurs, accusations. Thomas's jaw tightened. He reached for his rifle. Nahili wove to his side. "You don't have to," she said softly. "You can say you found me. Tell them you didn't know. Maybe they'll leave you be." But Thomas wasn't that man anymore.
He wasn't the man who ran from grief, wasn't the man who built walls to shut the world out, not since she arrived, not since she shared his fire, his silence, his pain. He looked at her. "No," he said, "I won't." He stepped to the door. His hand rested on the wooden bar as the wind slammed against it. He took a breath, then cracked it open just enough to step onto the porch. Snow lashed his face, his coat whipped behind him, and across the yard their figures loomed, 5 men on horseback, their rifles glinting in the stormlight. "We know you got her, Benton. She's an abomination," another spat. "An impurity on this land." Thomas raised his voice over the wind. "She's not hurting anyone. She's done nothing to you." "You think you own this land?" the leader barked, riding a few paces closer. "This is the Lord's land, and the sign was clear. Only the pure deserve to live." Thomas felt something sharp and hot rise in his chest. Anger. Not the kind that burns out fast, but the kind that holds. "I don't care about your damn sign," he shouted. "She's not going anywhere." The leader dismounted, drew a pistol. "Last chance, Benton. Step aside or get purified yourself." Thomas didn't flinch, didn't step back. "Go to hell," he said. The shot came fast, cracked like lightning. Pain exploded in Thomas's side. He staggered, fired back. His shot hit the leader's arm, spinning him with a shout. Chaos broke. Bullets thudded into the porch, shattered planks, kicked snow into the air. Thomas ducked back inside, slammed the door, and dropped to his knees. Blood seeped through his shirt. Nahili was at his side instantly. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling but her hand steady. "It's shallow," he winced, "but we can't hold them off, not from here." Gunfire peppered the walls. The cabin groaned. "It wouldn't hold. We have to run," he said. "Out the back, now." There was a vent carved into the rear wall, meant for summer air, barely big enough, but it was hope. He pushed her toward it. "Go!" She hesitated for half a breath, then crawled through. Thomas followed, every movement a fresh wave of pain. Outside, the world was white chaos. Snow swirled like smoke, but it was cover. "Stay low," he shouted. "Follow me." They stumbled through knee-high drifts, wind clawing at their faces. Thomas leaned on Nahili more than he wanted to. She moved through the storm like someone born to it. There was a stand of pine trees just beyond the ridge, low, gnarled, dense. They reached it and dropped to the ground, breath ragged, hearts pounding. Behind them, the cabin was under siege, but the blizzard masked their retreat. Nahili turned to him. "Which way?" "South," he gasped. "There's a canyon, a cave. We waited out there." She nodded. They didn't speak again, just moved. Each step was a test. Thomas's side throbbed, his vision swam. Nahili's ankle, still healing, slowed her, but she never stopped. Eventually, they reached the canyon rim, steep, slick, treacherous. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him, hand on his arm. "We go together." They descended, step by slow step. At one point he slipped, almost fell. She caught him, a woman who had been tied to a tree, now holding up the man who had set her free. By the time they found the cave, half covered in snow, hidden behind a curtain of stone, they were shaking from cold. Inside it was damp but still. Thomas collapsed near the fire pit, fumbled with frozen fingers for tinder. Nahili took over, built the fire with practiced calm. The warmth crawled through the dark, melted the edge off the storm outside. She turned to him, eyes searching. Why? He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because no one gets to decide who is pure," he said. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I let you take you." She didn't reply with words, just reached out, took his hand, held it. Out there the storm raged, hate waited, but in here, inside that cave carved from rock and desperation, 2 people, once broken, once cast out, had chosen to stand for something. Not out of heroism, not out of duty, but because sometimes standing up for one person is how we start to reclaim ourselves.
The wind had teeth. It bit into their skin, clawed through their clothes, screamed through the canyon like it was chasing them. But they didn't stop. Couldn't. Thomas and Nahili moved through the storm like two shadows leaning on one another, not for balance, but for survival. Behind them, the cabin was gone from sight, swallowed by snow and gunfire and hate. Ahead of them, only white. No trail, no clear path. Just memory, instinct, and the pounding need to get away. They reached the rim of the canyon just before dusk. Snow clung to every surface, disguising danger beneath beauty. Thomas knew this land like he knew the lines in his hands. There was a cave, small, dry, hidden by the rock wall. He'd used it before during bad winters, never thinking it would one day become a refuge from more than weather. Every step down the slope sent pain through his side. The bullet wound was shallow, but cold made it burn. Nahili stayed close, her arm steady beneath his even as she limped on her injured ankle. Together they moved like wounded animals, slowed, hunted, but determined. They reached the cave just as the last light bled from the sky. Snow had drifted against the entrance, but Thomas knew where to look. A faint trail of smoke once marked the place. Nahili spotted it first. There, she said. Inside the air was cold but still, silent. A small miracle in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Thomas dropped to his knees near the fire ring, fumbled with frozen hands for flint and tinder. Nahili knelt beside him, her fingers surer, faster. She coaxed the spark into flame, added kindling, fed it into warmth. They sat in the firelight, close but not touching, steam rising from their damp clothes. Thomas gritted his teeth as he peeled off his coat and shirt, blood crusted to the fabric. Nahili didn't flinch. She retrieved the cloth from his pack, warmed water over the flames, and began cleaning the wound. Her touch was careful but not hesitant. She had done this before. Maybe not to men like him, but to brothers, uncles, people who came home damaged by a world that didn't care. He watched her as she worked, watched her concentration, her strength. She wasn't just surviving, she was anchored, and somewhere deep inside him something shifted. Why? She asked quietly. Not about the wound, not about the pain, but about why he stayed, why he fought, why he chose her. He took a breath, not because he needed air, but because he needed courage. I couldn't leave you, he said. His voice was rough, cracked from cold and emotion. Not like that. Not for that. He turned toward the fire, watching it flicker. I came out here thinking I deserved to be alone, that I'd lost too much to try again. But when I found you, it wasn't just you who needed saving. I was disappearing. You pulled me back. Nahili stared at him. Then she said simply, You saved me. He shook his head. You helped save me too. Those words hung in the space between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. Outside the storm roared. But inside that cave, a different kind of weather settled. One made of trust, of shared breath, of something fragile taking root. They sat shoulder to shoulder now, warmed by flame, by silence, by the weight they no longer carried alone. For the first time since the beginning, Thomas didn't feel like a man running from grief. He felt like a man returning to something. Not to a place, not even to a person, but to himself. Because healing rarely looks like triumph. Most of the time, it looks like this: a cave, a fire, and someone who stays.
When the storm finally passed, the world outside the cave was unrecognizable. The canyon was blanketed in white, soft, pure, untouched. It looked peaceful. But for Thomas and Nahili, it was more than just snow. It was silence after chaos, stillness after survival. It was a new beginning, hiding beneath a layer of cold. They couldn't go back. The cabin was no longer an option. Even if the blizzard had buried their tracks, the hate that came knocking on their door hadn't melted with the snow. They both knew it, spoken or not. That place was no longer safe. Maybe it never had been. So they made a choice. They would head south, toward the lands Nahili once spoke of, toward her aunt if she still lived, toward something that resembled sanctuary. The journey wasn't a heroic march. It wasn't clean or easy.
It was slow, painful, cold. They walked side by side through snowdrifts that swallowed their knees, over frozen creeks, along ridges where the wind seemed to test their will with every step. Their supplies were low, water scarce, the food they carried barely enough. But something had shifted. The burden of the road wasn't carried alone. When Thomas faltered, his wound aching, his breath shallow, Nahili would stop, say nothing, and wait. Just her stillness beside him made the next step easier. And when Nahili limped, her ankles still tender, Thomas would offer his arm. Not as a savior, not as someone stronger, but as someone equal in need. Because what they were building now had nothing to do with survival. It had everything to do with presence. There's something profoundly human about walking through hardship with someone beside you. It changes the way you see pain. It transforms silence into solidarity. And when you've both come from places where the world told you you didn't belong, sharing the road becomes sacred. At night, they made small fires where they could. They sat close, not out of necessity, but out of something deeper. Thomas would sometimes catch himself watching Nahili as she stared into the flames. There was strength in her stillness, a quiet that didn't come from submission, but from knowing exactly who she was, even if the world didn't. And every time he looked at her, he felt something shift inside him. Not just gratitude, not just affection, something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. One afternoon, after days of trudging through white silence, they found a small spring bubbling through the snow. It shouldn't have been flowing, but it was. Clear, cold, alive. They drank, hands cupped, letting the cold wash over their exhaustion. Then they sat together by the edge, too tired to speak, too comfortable to need words. Nahili looked at him, her face soft in the low light. "You saved me, Thomas," she said quietly. He looked back at her. "You helped save me too." There it was again, that truth between them. They weren't what the world had wanted them to be. He wasn't the silent, broken man who stayed hidden from the pain, and she wasn't the outcast left to die for daring to speak. They were something new, something whole. And then, almost without thinking, almost without fear, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't pull away. He leaned in. She met him halfway. Their kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a climax. It was gentle, steady, a slow breath in the middle of a long journey. It said, "We're still here." It said, "We've survived." And most of all, it said, "You matter to me." Because when the world tries to erase you, when it tells you you're unworthy, impure, unlovable, the most radical thing someone can do is see you anyway, see your pain, your strength, your heart, and choose you. Together they stood. The path ahead was still long, uncertain. They didn't know if Nahili's aunt would still be there. They didn't know if the men who came to hunt her would try again. But now they faced the unknown together, and that made all the difference. Because belonging isn't a place. It's not a building or a border or a bloodline. Belonging is standing beside someone who doesn't flinch at your scars. It's walking forward with someone who understands your silences. It's learning that no one, not a town, not a tribe, not even a name burned into wood, gets to define your worth. Thomas and Nahili weren't pure. They were something better. They were whole. And that is enough to begin again.